The story began when the heroine's father brought home a boy he'd kidnapped. But the heroine of this story was not actually a heroine, but rather a villainess. And it was there that Roxana had first met the original heroine's brother. She'd stared down at the boy with defiant golden eyes as they noted that he'd need to be taught a lesson, and she'd smiled an amused smile, ready to break him into submission. But Roxana wasn't actually the spoilt princess she appeared to be. No, for she'd been reincarnated in a novel called The Abysmal Flower, a romance tragedy. It was a novel about the female protagonist, Sylvia, who would experience great hardships at the hands of the male leads. Kidnapping, incarceration, and more tragedies would befall her. There were 5 families that held the greatest power: the Black Agrice family, the Blue Pedelian family, the Gold Versium family, the White Fapelian family, and the Red Castro family. Sylvia was the daughter of the head of the Blue Pedelian family, also known as the archenemies of the Black Agrice family. She was beloved by her family, and she'd possessed their signature traits, shimmering azure hair and golden eyes. But tragedy struck when the heir, her only brother, Cassius, went missing. And the man responsible was none other than the head of the Black Agrice family, Lan Agrice. He sat, legs crossed, as he'd ordered arrogantly for the boy to be thrown in the dungeon, and as Cassius was dragged past Roxana, she knew that they were in quite the dilemma. But she'd had her own plans, and late into the night, she'd trotted down the stairs to the dungeons and demanded the keys from the guard who'd stood on night duty. He flushed at the sight of her beauty but resisted, as he'd been told not to allow anyone entry. She used her feminine wails as she pouted and once again requested the keys. And this time, the guard was no match for her clever tricks, so he'd handed it to her with no further complaint. She'd stepped through, much to the guard's dismay, and she'd promised to be back soon, so there would be no reason to report this to her father. Her heels clicked on the stone floor as she made her way in, the lamp in her hands illuminating her path. And in one cell she found him, bloody and strung up like a doll. "How cruel," she said, her voice soft but indifferent. She'd save him, she decided, since he was her only means of survival. But before that, she needed to navigate this thorny path carefully. That was the Agrice family. They had a strange tradition called the banquet, which was more about power dynamics than anything else. Lan Agrice had more than 10 wives and, in turn, produced many more children. But of these troves of children, the accomplishments of 3 in particular stood out, and thus Lan allowed them to join him at the banquet every month. And while she'd never had a place at that table as a child, she did now as a result of one incident, much to the distaste of many. Roxana's mother had honey blonde hair that shimmered like gold and deep blue eyes like those of a calm lake. And it was her gentle voice that Roxana had heard for the first time in this world, and she'd come to terms with her reincarnation. However, her first meeting with her father was vastly different, to say the least. He'd stated in a detached voice, "We'll name her Roxanne," and with that, he was gone, having not spared a moment more. She'd never liked the man, and she'd expressed as much through a loud wail. Her mother would comfort her with a smile and kind words. She'd stated how proud Roxana should make the Agrice family. Roxana thought the name to be familiar until recognition hit like a lightning bolt, and it was then Roxana realized the type of family she'd been born into. A family of criminals, rulers of the underground world, immersed in theft, fraud, poison, and murder. It was a path that couldn't be deviated from for those born in the Agrice family, a legacy of sorts passed down through the generations. And to become a true Agrice, one had to undergo training from an early age, and Roxana was no exception. And while she'd excelled in academics, she'd had no skill in swordsmanship, which her father found to be truly pathetic, now considered utterly useless. And since then, he'd never spared her a glance. She'd had one true sibling, Akil, born from the same mother and 4 years older than her. He'd been remarkably innocent considering the Agrice blood that ran through his veins. She'd complained that her father wanted her to begin preparations for courtship, and this news had shocked Akil too, and after explaining that their mother had been aware of this as well, he'd assured her that everything would be all right because he'd protect her. But Roxana was unaware of Achilles' trembling hands as he'd aimed a smile her way. They'd wanted no part of the Agrice legacy, and they'd made sure to keep out of anyone's way. That is, until the incident occurred. His body had been returned to them, bloody and lifeless. He'd never made it through the special training, and he'd died at an early age. And it was then that she'd learned that she'd never remain safe unless she played the game the Agrice way. And now she pulled out a flask of water and tipped the contents into his mouth. He'd instinctively swallowed, and the taste of it woke him. His golden eyes, disoriented, had looked around in confusion until he'd spotted Roxana looming over him, and he'd flayed in anger. But she'd hushed him for his noise would bring them unwanted attention. She covered his mouth as she ordered Cassis to swallow since it was the antidote. And with a smile, she said, "Believe it or not, I'm here to save you." For her survival depended on his. But Cassis wouldn't be so easily convinced, and he pulled at his rattling chains violently, the sound echoing around them. And while she'd understood his mistrust, she was short on time and couldn't wait for the antidote to work, which would prove her sincerity. She whacked him in the stomach, hard enough for the man to lose consciousness once again, and he drooped against her body. "I'm sorry," she said softly. She returned the next day to him, and he'd glared at her, eyes full of hostility. But his deep voice rang out in the quiet room, firm as he demanded, "What did you feed me?" She explained that it was the antidote to the drug he'd been forced to consume, and if not for her, he'd still be in extreme pain. She wondered if he felt better now considering that he had the mind to ask questions, but Cassis scoffed at her, and he'd wanted to know her motive for feeding him the antidote. But she said plainly, "I want nothing," and she questioned if his name was Cassis Pt1. He gritted his teeth to control his anger, but it soon erupted from in a shout because he was certain she knew his identity and therefore played ignorant. He demanded to know if she was one of the filthy Agrice, but she didn't answer, for she smiled as she took in his murky irises, which confirmed her suspicions. Cassis Pt1 was temporarily blind, and he grunted in annoyance at having his weakness discovered. She waved her fingers in front of him as she questioned him, but he only shouted for her to get out, having had enough of her mockery. She pulled his shirt up, and the mark on his body proved Roxana's thoughts to be true. It was sorcery and not poison that was the cause of his condition, but she assured him that the spell was temporary so it wouldn't last long. She'd leave his eyes as is, as he'd be able to see again in about 2 days. She grasped him by the chin, her touch startling him as she explained that she'd meant every word about helping him, and with that she walked out, ignoring the sound of his voice as he shouted for her to wait. She'd made it a routine to visit him many times after that, and on particular visits she'd questioned if he'd now believed her earnestness, but Cassis hadn't let down his guard with Roxana and had only chased her out. But his scalding tone didn't faze Roxana, and instead she'd brought him a more appetizing meal considering he'd been fed food that only rodents would find enjoyable. She'd shown him the pearl and explained that it was a meal replacement pill, but Cassis refused to accept anything from the hands of an Agrice, and he'd said as much, but Roxana only sighed at his stubbornness. And with a mighty punch to the gut, that knocked the air out of Cassis. He'd shouted out in fury once again at having been hit, and she explained that she'd planned to knock him out and feed the pill to him. Cassis knew he was dealing with a real psycho when she shoved the pill into his half-open mouth and forced him to swallow. He could only gaze at her, at a loss for words, but uttered one question. "What's your name?" She told him that she was called Roxana, and he thought how suitable that name was for her, a woman he could barely see, safe for her eyes that shone like rubies. They were as crimson as the break of dawn, he thought to himself. And later, she'd released the butterflies as she stood on her private balcony, and Emily, a maid, entered with a glass of water and a powder encased in a piece of paper. Emily explained that Roxana was at stage 5 of the natarium intake, and the dose would be increased by 0.2 as of today, tallying it up to a lethal dose of 4.7. She further stated the symptoms that accompanied the increased dosage, such as stomach pain, temporary paralysis, and likely hemoptysis. All agreases underwent the process of building immunity against poison by gradually administering non-lethal amounts, and in Roxana's case, she developed a resistance against most poisons. However, she continued with this task for a specific reason. She inquired about Jeremy's whereabouts as she drank the poison, but he burst into the room like a tornado. He smiled as he stated that he was ready to escort her. Jeremy was Roxana's half-brother, and he was also the antagonist of the story. In the beginning of The Abysmal Flower, Sylvia is kidnapped by the Agrease family, and it's there that she learns of the death of her older brother and suffers a mental breakdown, leading to the annihilation of the entire Agrease family. And the main culprit of those unfortunate events is Jeremy Agrease. He inquired if she'd been in the greenhouse, monitoring the butterfly eggs, and she'd wanted to make it a success since it was the only remaining egg. But Jeremy pouted, upset that she'd have to lose more blood to achieve her goals, and she smiled at his adorable behavior. But his frown turned upside down as he wondered why they'd been banned from seeing the new toy, aka Cassis. Roxana noted that he seemed quite special, and her words surprised Jeremy since she'd never had an interest in any other toy before. She was quite intrigued by the boy, she said, and Jeremy shrugged easily, consenting to his sister's wants, and she laughed softly. She patted his head gently as a reward, and Jeremy basked in her adoration. Soon they took their seats at the table, and he congratulated them on the monthly achievements, he said with a smirk, and with those words, the banquet got underway. He inquired about Roxana's butterfly experiment, as he'd noted her regular visits to the second palace. She'd explained that while the first 2 eggs had ended in failure, she'd had high hopes for the 3rd egg since it appeared to be in good health. He praised her dedication to the experiment. She'd noticed his mirth, and he stated just how much she resembled his younger self. He shared information that the Pedelians searched for their missing heir, and Jeremy wondered about the new toy's connection to the Pedelians. And upon hearing that he was the heir, Jeremy jolted in shock. Roxana played ignorant, and she complimented him for having captured the Pedelian heir. Lant grew suspicious at Roxana's sudden interest in a toy when she'd shown none before, and she explained that this one was different since the Pedelians were known to be virtuous and impartial, and the heir himself thought to be upstanding amongst them all. She smiled gleefully as she stated, "Wouldn't it be fun for the most noble Pedelian beneath her feet, barking like a horny little dog?" Lant burst into a fit of laughter at her depraved smile, and with that, the banquet had come to a close. And on their way back to their private rooms, Jeremy couldn't contain his anxiousness at Roxana's unusual interest in the new toy, for he didn't want to lose her attention. He questioned if she'd be teaching the toy lessons all by herself, and she affirmed his thoughts. But their conversation was interrupted by a bratty-looking child as she pointed at Roxana in anger. She'd overheard their conversation and stated she'd already laid claim to the new toy. Unperturbed by the little girl's fury, Roxana stated that she'd discussed it during the banquet with their father, and a decision had already been made. But the little girl named Charlotte wouldn't accept this decision, but soon Jeremy stood before her, protective of Roxana. She'd recalled Charlotte as she'd made a fuss at being denied entry to see Cassis when she'd never been denied anything before, resulting in her bratty behavior now. She'd shouted out that she'd report this to their father, but Roxana's cold voice silenced the little girl in an instant. Her red eyes bore into the girl, and Charlotte stepped back, wary as Roxana questioned, "Since when did all toys belong to you?" And so she'd stated that while she'd had the privilege of playing with toys, it was only because Roxana had never had any interest in them, that is, until now. She pulled loose the pins from her hair as she stepped forward, and her golden locks cascaded down her back. She looked every bit the villainess as she loomed over the little girl, and she said in a derisive voice, "Did you really think you'd always have everything your way? I didn't expect you to be that stupid." She held the hairpins in her hands like weapons as she'd now teach the little girl a lesson. Soon she left the little girl trembling and bloody, and as she walked away, Jeremy offered to finish her little lesson. He grabbed Charlotte by the hair, and his blue eyes glared down at the little girl, thoroughly annoyed by both her and the blue Pedelian. But an idea came to mind to get the new toy away from Roxana, and he whispered to Charlotte that the new toy was none other than Casus Pedelian. "Too bad there's only one of them," he said with a mocking laugh. Charlotte's eyes widened in shock, and she grinned maliciously as Jeremy questioned, "You wouldn't try to destroy him because you can't have him, now would you?" And while Jeremy concocted his own scheme, Roxana visited the greenhouse once again. The poisonous air permeated around her, enough to kill any regular person. However, Roxana had a strong immunity against it. She touched the large egg fondly, noting its growth since her last visit. The poisonous butterfly was a rare demonic species almost impossible to locate. She'd, however, achieved this through her knowledge about the book. The greenhouse, filled with poisonous air, was an ideal environment to breed and hatch the eggs. However, the success rate was less than 30%. What she'd found quite difficult was the training of these creatures, but she'd nonetheless found a way. She pulled up her sleeve and, with a knife, sliced a deep cut into her arm. Blood dripped from the wound and poured down onto the egg. In order to establish control over the poisonous butterflies, the master was to feed them her blood on a regular basis. This would result in faster hatching and stronger butterflies. She noted that she'd need to increase her daily poison intake if she were to get the egg to hatch faster. In the book, one of the male leads, the White Tamer, uses his ability of taming all sorts of creatures to tame the demonic butterflies upon discovery. And while she possessed no such ability, she would use any means to gain many advantages to increase her chances of survival. She patted the egg gently as she'd noted Dion's absence at the banquet, which was unusual as his accomplishments always took up the position of first place. A feeling of foreboding overcame her, and she knew she'd need to keep her wits about her. And upon her return, Emily reported an incident at the dungeon where a guard was discovered unconscious, and Roxana had an inkling that this was the doing of the brat, Charlotte, who'd certainly been provoked by Jeremy. Emily explained that Charlotte had forced her way in, attacked the prisoner, and she'd accidentally destroyed the magical shackles. Roxana was taken aback, as she was sure that Charlotte didn't possess enough power to destroy shackles meant to hold down giant demons. She was sure that Casus had manipulated Charlotte into breaking the chains, and she smiled, thoroughly amused. But her mask of detachment slipped in place upon the sight of her mother. Her mother smiled sweetly in greeting, and she'd wanted to give congratulations as she'd heard that Roxana had obtained second place in the list of accomplishments. But she froze, and her eyes widened in fright at the sight of blood on Roxana's arm. She hid her arm behind her as her mother trained worried eyes on her. Her mother took note to change the subject, and she stated how proud she was. Roxana thanked her mother for her kind words, but stated that she was quite tired and would like to retire early so she didn't have the energy to spend time with her. Her mother flinched at Roxana's frosty tone and, with a masked smile, wished her mother well. The door slammed shut with a resounding thud in the quiet room, and Roxana ordered Emily to make a cup of tea with an extra dose of poison. She thought about her innocent brother, who died like an animal, and while she'd held no resentment for her mother, she acknowledged that it was no longer possible to restore their relationship to what it once was. Down in the dungeons, the guards repeatedly kicked Casus as he threw a slew of remarks at the Pedelian. But Casus' unwavering gaze only infuriated the guard more, but he knew not to damage the toy too much since he now belonged to Lady Roxana. He walked away, and his words coupled with the little girl's words from earlier puzzled Casus, as both had mentioned Roxana. But soon his thoughts went to the chains, and thanks to the little girl, he now knew how they worked. The more the prisoner resisted, the tighter the shackles became. However, as long as one remained calm, the activation of the shackles could be kept to a minimum. But he'd bid his time until he escaped safely and until they'd let their guard down, especially Roxana Agrice, who he was sure had already noticed the uselessness of the shackles. He didn't know what to make of her, and he wondered just how much trust he should place in her. Some time had passed before they'd brought him before Lant, and the man trampled Casus repeatedly as he'd mocked Casus for his relation to Roussel Pedelian, who'd had the same arrogant look in his eyes that Casus held. And the defiant look never left his eyes, no matter how much he got hit. He lit his cigar and noted that he'd only brought him here and not his sister because he'd assumed Cassis would last longer, and at the mention of his sister, Cassis almost lost his temper. He smiled as he handed the leash to Roxana and stated that he'd gift the Pedelian to her as a birthday present since it had just passed. And up until now, Roxana, who had stood quiet throughout the entire exchange, thanked her father and grinned widely in anticipation as she stated, "I won't disappoint you, father. I'll make sure he's properly trained." Her father left, and she wiped her hands as she ordered for Cassis to be cleaned up since she'd had no interest in playing with a dirty toy. The guards dragged him away, and Roxana grew suspicious at the sudden gift since her father had never remembered her birthday before. The guards wondered why this particular toy had caught the attention of the masters, but the one hushed him as he warned his curiosity would get him killed. He'd had luck on his side, they said, since he'd been chosen by Lady Roxana, and that if it were any of the other Agreases, he'd been laying with his guts spewed out by now. Cassis listened to every word they spoke, and he'd recalled her different demeanors. Only time would tell which one was true. They crossed paths with Roxana's mother, and she questioned who the boy they carried was. They explained that he was Roxana's new toy. Her mother was appalled that her daughter would torture someone so terribly, but the guard explained that it was the master's doing and not Lady Roxana. But she suddenly grabbed Cassis by his face as she shouted out her dead son's name, Akil, and the guards frantically tried to pull her away lest she get her hands dirty. They bowed and went on their way, and she stared at Cassis receding back, her azure eyes blurry. They were quite surprised with her sudden outburst, and one explained that Master Akil was around the same age when he died, and they wondered if Lady Roxana had taken an interest in the toy because of his resemblance to Akil. They entered a room and tossed him onto the ground, and Cassis continued to feign unconsciousness. They cleaned him up as best they could, and once left alone, restrained once again to the wall, his eyes shot open. He collected his thoughts and recalled that the Agreases were a massive family with over 10 wives, and he was sure the lady he'd met was the 4th wife. He wondered if Roxana helped him because she recalled her deceased older brother when she looked at him. Footsteps approached him, and he closed his eyes quickly once again. Roxana turned him over, assessed his injuries, and removed the mouth guard as she applied medicine to his wounded body. He tried his best to remain still, for he played the role of an unconscious toy. She sat down with a sigh and placed his head in her lap, and it was there that she gently stroked his hair. Cassis was stunned by this turn of events, and now he was stuck, unsure if he should continue to play the prone toy. She sifted her fingers through his fine, somewhat matted hair as she said softly, "I don't want to die yet, and I don't want you to either." He subtly flinched at her words, but remained still, lest the spell break. She leaned close and took a whiff of his hair as she wondered how it was that he'd not smelt at all. "Are you awake?" she questioned, and his heart beat uncontrollably at the thought of being caught and at her close proximity. He clenched his hands, ready to jump into action and escape, but her words stopped him once again as she apologized for not protecting him earlier and explained that she needed to keep up the facade of a wicked daughter to fool her father, or the consequences would be dire for them both. But now that he'd belonged to her, no one would touch him without her permission, so he'd be safe. She'd felt silly talking to him while he'd lay unconscious, but she'd wished for his good health. But unbeknownst to Cassis, Roxana was sure he was awake, and she'd said everything with an aim in mind, to get him to lower his guard. She got up as she promised to come again, and once she'd left the room, Cassis sat up, his ears flushed brightly at her sudden affection and unsure what to make of it. A little later, she'd walked in with a plate in hand to find Cassis sitting on the bed that she'd placed in the room. He stared at her, his eyes as cautious as ever. She stopped some feet away from him as she set the plate down and explained that she'd brought a physician in earlier to do a checkup, and he looked away quickly as he said, "I'm fine." He wondered why she'd personally brought his food to him when any maid could have done it, and she explained that she'd already ordered them to retrieve new clothes for him. She busied herself as she hung the lantern up, and the dim light glowed rather brightly. She was sure if she'd sent a maid, he would have overpowered the maid and ran away, and she couldn't let him escape yet. She turned to him as she told him to let her know if he required painkillers, but his blush caught her eyes, and she was sure it was because he'd been awake as she'd rubbed the ointment on his body. He bit the bullet and asked the question that had plagued his mind. Now that he was her toy, what was required of him? But she only demanded that he eat, sleep, and rest so that he recovered soon. And so she ordered that he eat the meal she'd brought him, and with those final words, she left. She returned a little later with a set of his new clothes, but his scarred body caught her eyes as he ripped off the shredded garment. So engrossed with her thoughts, the heavy metal door slammed shut, and the loud sound startled her. But what flustered her more was his half-naked body, and she wondered why it bothered her so. He called out to her as he stated that he needed a bath. She averted her gaze as she agreed and quickly directed him to the bathroom. But he held up his chained hands and explained that he couldn't do much being restrained. She'd come prepared for this, and she replaced his shackles with a collar. And at his glare, she'd stated that while it wasn't ideal, it was far better than what he'd had. The lock clicked in place and their eyes held, transfixed on each other before he glanced away. Her plan would go a lot smoother. She knew if he'd been entranced by her beauty like everyone else, but by the look on his face, she was sure that wouldn't happen anytime soon. She explained that the mansion was like a giant maze, so it would be impossible for him to find his way out while moving around undetected. And she warned him not to leave the room because running into another Agrease would lead to his demise. But his eyes widened in shock when she stated that she knew an alternate route to the exit, and she smirked, knowing that she had his attention now. The red butterflies fluttered around her, but soon they merged with the wall, ready to obey their master. She'd now be notified of all the happenings in the room, almost like a surveillance of sorts. But she grew more anxious as the butterfly she sent over to the western border hadn't returned, and she wondered if she should send another. She was sure the Pedelians would scour the area for their missing heir, but she had no way of knowing now. He stepped out of the bathroom, looking much better now that he'd cleaned himself up, and she patted the bed, a first aid kit beside her. He told her that he could tend to himself, but she wondered how he'd fare with the injuries on his back. And after a moment of silence, she explained that she was quite skilled since she'd been tending to wounds from an early age. At his curious gaze, she explained that she'd always treated her brother's wounds whenever he'd gotten hurt, and Cassis flinched at the mention of her dead brother. That seemed to win him over, and with a heavy sigh, he sat down beside her. He pulled at his shirt, taking it off and his muscular form contorting with every movement, and once removed, he ordered her to only treat his back and nothing else. She got to it, and as she smeared the ointment on his skin, despite his many scars, she admired his beautiful form. She grew entranced by the feel of his skin, and she was glad that she hadn't let Charlotte have him. She rubbed at a particular sensitive spot, and he flinched. He grabbed her by the hand as he stated that he'd continue to treat himself. "Now leave," he ordered, and she abided by his wishes. She was sure that he wasn't used to a woman's touch, and she'd noticed he'd become less hostile towards her. She announced that she'd arrange for a physician to visit tomorrow and bid him farewell for now. Later, she'd brought him his lunch, and he noted her continued personal visits, but she explained that she'd only wanted to make sure he ate well. She wiped at her eyes as she wondered about the sudden heat flushes and sweat on her skin. It caught them both by surprise as she let out a cough and blood spilled from her lips. She staggered as dizziness overtook her, and she sank to the floor as Cassis shouted in alarm. Roxana was sure that the reason for the sudden symptoms was none other than the dose of poison she'd taken the previous day, as she'd been feeling out of sorts since then. She apologized to Cassis for her discourteous behavior and stated it was nothing to worry about. She wiped the residual blood from her mouth as she said in an unbothered tone, "That probably ruined your appetite," and the man froze at her words. He insisted that vomiting blood was not a normal thing, and she told him that it would happen again. She questioned if he worried about her, and her words almost offended him as he said that it was normal behavior to worry about anyone that vomited blood. She thought about his words and how unmoved she would feel if she was on the other end of this scenario. But all the while she'd held this conversation with him, she'd been assessing his behavior, and she'd reached the conclusion that he put up a wall of strength in the face of those with power, but was quite empathetic to the weak. And as she left, she decided to show him the meek and weak side of her in order to crawl under the armor of hostility he put forth. And just as she'd closed the door, she encountered Jeremy, who called out her nickname, Xana, affectionately. But his smile froze on his face at the sight of blood on her dress. She explained that it wasn't hers, as she'd needed to punish the toy since he'd been rather difficult. Jeremy smiled in relief, but urged her not to wipe at the stains, but she frowned in disgust since she'd hated having his filthy blood on her. And as she walked to her room, she inquired why he'd been in front of the door of her toy, and he stated that he'd stopped by her room before he'd made his way here to find her. He sniffed the air as he wondered if she'd been to the greenhouse as the scent of poison drifted around her. She stopped in her tracks as she realized that the residual smell of poison coated her skin, and so she decided not to visit the greenhouse prior to seeing Cassius, otherwise it could affect him as well. He glanced at her nervously and said his thoughts aloud. He wondered if she could hand the egg off to someone else since he worried that she would have to keep feeding her blood to the creatures after hatching as well. But she glared at him in response as she warned him not to interfere with her business, for she wouldn't hold back her anger as she'd done before. Dismayed, Jeremy could only defend himself as he said that he only worried about her since many had died before her, and he was right. When one takes on the butterflies, they become both their master and host. And, even while she'd successfully tamed them, if she couldn't provide for them the blood they desired, she would be devoured. She sighed, knowing he genuinely cared for her, and she told him how much she appreciated him since he was the only person who cherished her. She reached forward, ready to give him his regular pat on the head, but stopped as she noted the blood on her hand. But Jeremy assured her he didn't mind as he pushed his head into her hand with a beaming smile. His unfiltered thoughts left his lips as he stated how glad he was the first 2 eggs had perished since she would have had a harder time raising more than one. He glanced at her, hoping he hadn't offended her with his words, and she assured him that he hadn't. They continued down the hallway all the while Roxana thought about the 2 eggs that she'd successfully hatched, unbeknownst to Jeremy or anyone else. She sliced into her skin, and the butterflies fluttered towards her, ready to feast. They were different from other demonic creatures, or any other species for that matter. Depending on the kind of poison that was fed to them and how strong that poison was, changed the very nature of these butterflies. They'd enjoyed Roxana's blood immensely since she'd ingested quite a bit of poison. And while there were only a few now, soon she'd have an entire army of her own. And for this reason, it was a well-kept secret that she'd hatched the eggs. And no one could find out about her butterflies. At least until she'd helped Cassius escape from this place. She ordered one to go to the western border, and it took off, ready to do her bidding. It was the first time she'd sent her butterflies so far, and, because of the great distance, her connection to them weakened significantly. She wiped at her wound, the amount of blood loss taking its toll on her body, which was already pushed to its limits. But she couldn't stop there, for she'd needed to maintain a strong connection to her butterflies, which she'd accomplished only through feeding. And now she would need to increase her dosage intake once more. She'd taken a walk in the garden, and it was there that she'd encountered Maria, Lantagree's 3rd wife. Roxana donned on her mask once again and fixed a pleasant smile in place as she gave her greetings. She complimented Roxana's beauty as a greeting, comparing her to that of her mother, and she took the flattery with grace. She offered her hand as she invited Roxana to have tea with her, and she looked at the woman's hand, barely concealing her distaste. She noted that she'd not seen Dion much too and ordered one of the servants to fetch him. But a maid spoke up as she told Maria that Dion was away at the moment due to the direct orders from their master. Roxana knew that this woman held no real interest in her only son. Upon request, the maid introduced herself as Lana and Maria paid her compliments for her pretty name. However, She smiled happily as she told the maid that she'd never given her permission to speak, and with a slash of her hand, the maid's head went flying. She ordered that her remains be fed to the monsters as she shook out her now blood-drenched parasol, although unconcerned about her blood-stained dress. She apologized to Roxana as she wondered if she'd gotten messed, and Maria smiled in relief when Roxana stated no. Roxana apologized, as she'd stated that she'd had matters that needed to be attended and therefore couldn't join Maria for tea. Smile still set on her face, she invited Roxana to her room for her next visit since she'd just bought a new wardrobe for her dolls. Roxana bowed in response and left sure that she'd never visit Maria's room of her own free will. Jeremy closed the door to the monster's lair with a slam, annoyed that he'd been put on duty of collecting their stingers without killing them. The two maids approached the doorway, and Jeremy suggested disposing of the body in another room because he knew if they went in there, they wouldn't survive. But the maid assured him that they were strong enough to handle those monsters, and upon revealing themselves to be the maid of Maria, he believed them since she'd always made it a point to pick the strongest maids. They entered the monster's lair, and the screeching and roars echoed in the room, and all the while Jeremy counted 119 seconds until they sprinted out of the room. Their faces displayed the horrors they witnessed in just 2 minutes, and Jeremy suggested that they find other jobs because they wouldn't last in the current one. They bowed in farewell and walked away, but one glanced back, and this drew Jeremy's attention, and after explaining, he followed them into the garden. Maria stood, still adorned in her blood-stained dress, and Jeremy called out to her. She smiled at him, but his face contorted in disgust at the sight of her, sure she'd partaken in her abhorrent hobby of hers, killing of the maids, but Maria's smile was all the answer he'd gotten in response. She noted how cute even his brooding nature was, but Jeremy only stated how nauseating the smell of blood was. She expressed her worry for him, noting that he'd been overworking himself, and she mentioned that Roxana too was guilty of this. At the mention of Roxana, Jeremy burst to life, and he wondered why his dear sister would be in Maria's company. She explained that she'd met her in the garden and wanted to share a cup of tea with her and Dion but couldn't. Jeremy interrupted in a vicious voice and told her to keep Dion away from Roxana. But Maria only wanted the two siblings to get along well, or so she claimed, but Jeremy knew that her innocent act was nothing but a facade to stir up trouble. He stated that the only brother Roxana had in her life was him. He grinned, confident in his words, before he stomped on the flowers in a rage as he recalled that she'd barely had any time for him now that she'd gained a toy. Maria's purple eyes glowed with intrigue at this bit of information, and after some inquiring, Jeremy said the toy was none other than Casus Pedelian. She let loose a wide smile, and she wondered what he was like. She turned away and ordered for someone to bring Luelle, but changed her mind, stating she'd go to her instead. She tried to coerce Jeremy into a visit to her room, but he vehemently denied her with a scoff. She would send an invitation to Roxana as soon as she returned to her rooms, she reminded herself. The parasol opened as she flung it onto her shoulder, and blood rained down all around her as she exclaimed how excited she was to have a tea party with Roxana and her new toy. Roxana climbed the steps to the mansion when she turned at the sound of her name. A guard ran towards her, and he bowed in greeting. It was the guard on duty from episode 1, and his name was Yon, which she called out in greeting, and he beamed, honored that she'd remembered. He handed her a bouquet of beautiful purple flowers. She smiled as he fumbled his way through expressing how happy he'd be if she accepted these flowers. And she took it with a smile and thanks. However, she knew what these flowers were. She entered Cass's room, bouquet in hand, and at his unblinking stare, explained she received it on her way here. He noted her good mood and wondered if it had anything to do with the flowers. She smiled in answer, but told him what a pity it was that they didn't last long, but offered them to Casus, sure he'd enjoyed them. But his eyes rounded as she handed them over, and he demanded to know who had given them to her, to which she'd explained it was one of her father's men. She knew why Casus had reacted the way he did, for she knew what those flowers were. They were an unnamed poisonous flower genetically modified by the Agris family. They were known to cause paralysis, enough to only make the hands and feet tingle. The experiment ended in failure, and thus the flowers were never used. This knowledge extended to only a few, and she wondered how Cassis had recognized them. His eyes narrowed as she stated she'd often received gifts like this. He ordered her to leave the flowers with him, but she worried that he'd only accepted under pressure. But he said he'd use it as decoration instead. But her actions next sent Cassis from bashful to panicked as she reached into her dress, and he slapped a hand over his eyes, sure the woman was crazy. She pulled out a folded sheet of paper as she'd explained she had nowhere else to hide them. He sighed, his raced heart slowing, and wondered what it was, which she'd explained with a grin, "It's a map of the mansion." And once she'd laid them out on the floor, she ordered Cassis to memorize the layouts because she'd burn them soon after. She told him that later she would take him on a tour around the mansion to affirm that the printables matched the house layout and to assuage his suspicions. She pointed to their location on the map and showed him the shortest route out. Sure, only she knew about that path upon discovering it by accident. However, there was a slight problem with using that path, but it was their best shot at escaping undetected.